The year was 1949. After a brutal 4-year conflict and immense international pressure, the Netherlands finally bowed to reality and recognized the independence of Indonesia. 3.5 centuries of Dutch rule in the sprawling archipelago had come to an end. But the story of how this came to be is not a simple one. How did a country as small as the Netherlands, a land barely the size of a single Indonesian island, manage to build and maintain control over a colony nearly 50 times its size, located halfway across the world? This is the story of how the Dutch rose from a fragile republic to masters of one of the richest and most diverse regions on Earth, Indonesia. Long before European colonizers arrived, was a mosaic of cultures, faiths, and kingdoms. Over 600 ethnic groups lived across the islands. Muslim sultanates flourished in Sumatra and Java. Buddhist and Hindu traditions persisted in Bali, and countless smaller kingdoms ruled their own territories. The islands were bound together not by a single state, but by the sea itself and ocean, a highway that carried spices, ideas, and armies from one island to another. And it was precisely these spices that first attracted the gaze of Europe. Nutmeg, cloves, peppercorn, cinnamon. These were not just flavors for food. In Europe, they were worth more than their weight in gold. They were used in medicine, in the kitchens of the wealthy, and as symbols of power. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to dominate the spice trade, establishing their stronghold at Malacca, while Spain extended its reach from the Philippines. When the Dutch Republic declared independence from Spain in 1581, after decades of brutal war, the new state needed wealth and recognition to survive. It had no colonies yet, no vast armies, but it did have ships, and so the Dutch turned their attention to the distant waters of the East Indies. Cornelis de Houtman, a Dutch trader, spent years in Lisbon, carefully studying the spice trade. He gathered intelligence about the routes, the markets, and the politics of the archipelago. When he returned to Amsterdam, he convinced wealthy investors that the Netherlands could challenge Portugal for control of the spice trade. In 1595, the first Dutch expedition set sail. The fleet passed down the African coast, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and entered the Sunda Strait. Their destination was Bali. The local kings welcomed them. The Dutch secured their first treaty of friendship and trade, though they only returned with a small cargo of peppercorns. The profit was so great that the voyage paid for itself many times over. Investors were convinced the future of the Dutch Republic lay not just in fighting Spain in Europe, but in seizing the spice trade overseas. Within a few years, multiple expeditions were launched. Ships spread across the Indian Ocean, some even attempting to reach the East Indies by circumnavigating the globe. The wealth they brought back was staggering. In one voyage, a fleet returned with a 400% profit. The lure of riches was irresistible. And soon, Amsterdam's merchants demanded more than just trading posts. They wanted dominance. In 1602, the Dutch States General created one of history's most powerful corporations, the Verenigde Oost-Indisch Company, or VOC, the Dutch East India Company. Unlike other merchants, the VOC was no ordinary trading house. It was granted immense powers by the Dutch government, the right to negotiate treaties with rulers, build forts, wage war, and administer justice. In effect, it was a state within a state, a private empire in service of profit. The VOC quickly set about tightening its grip on the Spice Islands. It established fortified outposts in Ambon, Batam, Banda. It waged war against Portuguese fleets and disrupted Spanish supply lines. The English East India Company soon appeared as a competitor, but cooperation between the two proved impossible. Spices were a limited resource, and both sides knew that only monopoly could guarantee profits. By 1608, Dutch commanders in Indonesia were ordered not just to trade but to conquer. The man who transformed the Dutch presence in Indonesia was Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, a hard and ruthless governor. Cohen believed that the spice trade was a matter of national survival and that only through force could the Dutch maintain control. When local rulers resisted Dutch fortifications in Java, Cohen responded with war. In a dramatic campaign, he destroyed the city of Jakarta, then rebuilt it as a new Dutch capital. which he named Batavia after the legendary Batavia tribe, considered the ancestors of the Dutch people. Batavia would remain the center of Dutch power in Asia for centuries. With Batavia secure, the Dutch turned on their European rivals. They expelled the English from their factories and gradually drove the Portuguese from their strongholds. 1641, they captured Malacca, the key to controlling the straits between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Spanish influence, already weakened, collapsed soon after. By the mid-1600s, the Dutch were the undisputed European power in Indonesia. But conquest was not only about fighting Europeans. The VOC systematically brought local sultans and kingdoms under its sway. Some were defeated in battle, like the Sultan of Ternate, who was captured and then restored as a Dutch vassal. Others, like the Sultan of Mataram and Java, became clients. After civil wars relying on Dutch support to secure their thrones, one by one, the native states of the archipelago found themselves tied to the Dutch through treaties, debts, or force of arms. At its peak, the VOC controlled vast territories and commanded a fleet that patrolled from India to Japan. Batavia bustled. With trade, its warehouses filled with nutmeg, cloves, pepper, and cinnamon. Yet this empire of profit was costly to maintain. Fortresses had to be garrisoned, navies had to be paid, and piracy was a constant threat. Wars with Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries further drained resources. Slowly, the once mighty company began to decline. By the late 1700s, corruption, mismanagement, and competition eroded its power. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War proved disastrous. In 1799, after nearly 2 centuries of dominance, the VOC was dissolved. Its possessions were transferred to the Dutch crown, which now directly governed Indonesia as a colony. Dutch rule survived into the 19th and 20th centuries, but it was no longer unchallenged. Britain occupied the islands during the Napoleonic Wars, though they were later returned. In the early 1900s, nationalist movements began to stir. The dream of independence, once distant, grew stronger with each passing generation. Then came the Second World War. The Japanese invaded and occupied Indonesia, shattering Dutch control. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Indonesian leaders declared independence. The Dutch tried to return, launching a series of military campaigns to reassert their rule. But times had changed. The world had entered a new era of decolonization, and international pressure mounted against the Netherlands. After years of bloody conflict, The Hague finally gave in. In December 1949, the Netherlands formally recognized the independence of Indonesia. 3.5 centuries of foreign domination had ended. A nation once carved up for its spices had reclaimed its destiny. The story of Dutch Indonesia is a story of ambition and greed, of violence and resilience, but above all, it is the story of a people who, despite centuries of colonization, never lost the dream of freedom.